Well, hello everybody. This is now lecture 7 in the series, and I'm going to share my screen and we can kick off. Right, so I'm actually going to cover chapters 12 and 13. And partly the reason for this is there's an awful lot of content that I want to discuss, but also because just the pace of the reading group. I mean, we can keep a monthly schedule of lectures and just cover 2 of these chapters rather than chapter 14 as well. Okay, it's good if you can mute people. So just to say that, I mean, I do have a political approach to reading Marx's Capital, and that is anti-imperialism. And just to give you an example, this is what we did in London last Tuesday, which was the commemoration of the mine workers in South Africa murdered by the police in South Africa on behalf of a British mining corporation, Lonmin. And so what I like about this, and why I'm showing the pictures, is the broad spread of internationalism, which was there. Comrades from Latin America, from All African Women's Group, from Tamil, and many others as well. So from the Black community in London. So I'm very pleased with that. And it's that type of politics that actually I think is the culmination, or if you like, the correlate of my reading of Capital, and I'll try to explain that as we go through. So now when I keep showing this one just to navigate where we are. Okay, so where we are now is in the heart of volume 1, where Marx is looking at surplus value, and he's looked at absolute surplus value, and he's going to now move into relative surplus value. This really is at the conceptual heart of the book. He's taken us from circulation into production, and if you like, from the essence, from the appearance to the essence. He'll go back to the appearance again, but that's what the movement is. So here we are, this little green arrow. We're moving from absolute surplus value into relative surplus value. I just want to do a quick recap. You're probably now quite comfortable with this concept. It's a very simple diagrammatic representation of absolute surplus value Marx uses, where he says, well, if we've got a working day of length AC, each dash actually does represent an hour, then the way capital can increase absolute surplus value is by increasing the surplus labor time, which is this BC, by making the working day longer. So the battle over the working day is also a battle over how much exploitation is taking place. Workers over centuries were forced to work longer and longer. And then in the 19th century, as we've been reading, there were battles to try and limit the exhaustion of the working class in England and to limit the working day down to 10 hours. Now, in this discussion, the variable, if you like, is this BC. The length of the working day will then sort of go into how much surplus labor capital can appropriate. And Marx does assume throughout this that the AB, which is the necessary labor time, is more or less fixed, doesn't move very much. And he's saying that's because he wants to set, look at the different variables one at a time. But he's also got a general tendency to say that labor power is bought and sold at its value. And even when it's bought and sold at its value, exploitation takes place. He's quite concerned to show that exploitation does not rely on labor power being sold below its value. And he shows that very fully. I mean, he succeeds in doing that without a doubt. And I use this diagram, which is a sort of extension of Marx's ABC. There's his ABC, the timeline. And I'm just using Marx concepts and trying to represent them. He actually shows in part 1 of Capital how the substance of labor is reflected in exchange value, and that has to be measured in money. So when we talk about surplus value and variable capital and constant capital, it must always be in money. I mean, surplus value as a concept includes the dimension of money. So you have surplus labor and you have necessary labor, the total labor time, and between them, that's a worker's time, which when it's embodied in the commodity adds a new value, and in this case it's 6 shillings. And of course what Marx, and again we discussed this quite a lot, also says, as well as creating new value, simultaneously the worker recreates the existing value of the means of production, the raw materials and the machinery. Okay, so then what Marx does is he explains what he means by exploitation within the capitalist mode of production. And what's different about wage labor as the general form of labor in the capitalist mode of production is you can't visibly see the exploitation, it's hidden. But what Marx is, through his power of analysis, he quite rightly brings out that which is not clear on the surface. And that is that there is this internal division of the working day, the first part during which the worker works for a time which is the equivalent, produces the equivalent value of their wage. Variable capital equals wages, okay? And then beyond that, they work for the capitalist. You can conceive this slightly differently, and Marx explains this again very well, which is you can also conceive this as of each minute in the working day, they're working partly for themselves and partly for the capitalists. I mean, it more or less amounts to the same thing, except when we're talking about battles to extend the length of the working day. Clearly, capital wants to extend the length of the working day as long as possible in order to get more surplus labor, to have commodities of greater value, to realize a greater surplus value when they sell those commodities. So the degree of exploitation of the workers' labor power by capital can be viewed, Marx explains to us, either as the proportion of surplus value over variable capital, or in the first instance, what amounts to the same thing, the ratio of surplus labor to necessary labor. So this dimension is time, this dimension is money. Time is money. Now, what I didn't talk about last time, and what I would like to bring out from reading in the group, the discussion which Marx has, the long discussion he has about the struggle for limiting the working day, including in particular the Factory Acts, right? And it comes to a head round about 1846, 1847. And the story of the Factory Acts is that what was known as the 10-hour Act was actually passed in 1846 for implementation in 1848. Now, what also happened in that period is that capital mobilized the workers on a false prospectus, if you like, or they tried to get workers to say that they were opposed to the limits of the working day. But in discussing this, Marx points out that there was a crisis in 1846-47. And he quotes here one of the many reports from the factory inspectors. During this crisis, there was workers were thrown into debt. I mean, mills closed, there was short time working, hundreds and thousands of workers were in very tough conditions, already in even tougher conditions, right? Now, Marx adds to this that in this period, the mill owners cut wages of the workers by 10%. I mean, like by fiat outright. And then in addition, they continue to cut wages in proportion to the shorter working day. So by the end of the reduction from 12 hours to 10 hours, wages had been forced down by at least 25%. Now, Marx considers crisis as an inherent part of capitalist mode of production. In his sort of mature lifetime in England, there were 3 crises, or 4 if you go beyond Das Kapital's publication. And he does write about these in different parts of the Kapital. So this sort of wage reduction in the crisis is a necessary feature of capitalism. And this is even before we start talking about, if you like, the geographic displacement of wage cuts outside the main capitalist centers, i.e. imperialism. So, but even, if you like, as a temporal dynamic within the capitalist mode of production, which will periodically go into crisis, one of the characteristics of the crisis is that wages will be cut and forced down, because that is actually the precondition for the recovery for capital from the crisis. So Marx uses the terminology of wage cuts are a price for labor power below its value. Okay, so he's established the idea that the value of labor power is the sort of basket of goods and their prices, which you would expect workers would normally expect to consume in order to, on a weekly, monthly, and lifetime basis. Now, what he's saying here is that the price will go below the value, which means that that normal expected standard of living will be cut. The workers won't be able to buy so much. There will be fewer use values. They won't be able to consume so much. Workers' consumption will be hit. And of course, this is exactly what's happening in Britain and basically all over the world today, with wage cuts at order of the day. So this is an inevitable and sort of necessary feature of capitalist mode of production. The other diagram which I showed last time and I want to revisit is this idea of the labor process as being capital's domain. And it's here that capital pushes to increase labor productivity. And we have, again, a sort of a pictorial representation of Marx's favorite leading example, which is the spinning of cotton into yarn. Now, what he does in chapter 10, which is very interesting, is he gives us a lot of glimpses into the relation not only of workers in any given workplace, mill, factory, but with the rest of the working class. He begins to develop his explanation of how labor markets work. And so it's not an isolated microeconomic unit he's talking about here. This is an instance of a wider pattern of class relations. And this he develops much further when he comes to the general law of accumulation in chapter 5 of volume 21. But he's already giving us some idea that if workers are made redundant in one place, clearly that affects the class as a whole. And so there's a question of how workers reproduce themselves as a collective, as a class. The other thing that he's going to go on to develop, and what we're going to look at more closely, is the reproduction of workers in terms of the reproduction of their labor power. And so we've got a product here, we've got a commodity, which is yarn. Yarn could be consumed by workers, not so much directly, but maybe indirectly. Yarn that goes into the cloth, that goes into the shirts, if they're men, or dresses, I guess, if they're women, right? So what you've got is a loop here. Okay, so the commodities, not all, because I mean, if we're talking about yachts, not many workers consume yachts, but they do consume clothing, right? So you have this sort of feedback loop to what the workers produce is also depending what they also consume, the commodities they consume, and that affects the value of their labor power. Okay, and that's what Marx is going to look at in some detail. So it's not strictly true that the labor process as such is the only domain of capital. What we're actually talking about is broader social reproduction, broader class relations. But the way methodologically Marx treats this is definitely he sort of drives this from the mode of production in the more narrow sense, from the labor process, from the production of capital. Okay, that's all a slight recap, but also preparing us for what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about this in quite a lot of detail in actual fact, because it is really crucial to understanding Marx's overall argument. So I've already mentioned this. Okay, Marx reconfirms at the beginning of chapter 12 that he's talking about AB as a constant magnitude. He's not talking about wage cuts. He's talking about the value of labor power being fairly, if not fixed, then fairly firm. Let's put it like that. Okay. So the necessary labor time, he says, well, let's say we have a wage of 5 shillings and that can be reproduced. The value of that can be reproduced by 10 hours labor time. And so if it's a 12-hour working day, that leaves 2 hours of surplus labor time in which the surplus value of 1 shilling will be produced. So what are the ways, apart from increasing the length of the working day, that we can increase surplus value? Not we, can the capitalists increase surplus value? And the really obvious one is that this AB is shorter. So he shows us this diagram where now this is only 9 hours and this is 3 hours. So the length of the overall working day isn't longer, but the necessary labor time has been shortened. And that's the same as saying that the worker, instead of being paid 5 shillings, are now only paid 4.5 shillings, 4 shillings and 6 pence, right? So he does say quite definitely this is pushing the wage of the worker down below the value of his labor power. Okay, so that means that the surplus value increases by 1 hour or 6 pence when it's turned into money. And so this is a mechanism by which capital can increase the surplus value it's taking from labor. And what it means is the workers have got to consume less. I mean, taken just simply as a wage cut, that's what it means, a cut in the standard of living of the working class. But Marx says, despite the important part which this method plays in practice, we are excluded from considering it here by our assumption that all commodities, including labor power, are bought and sold at their full value. Okay, so he says, oh, I know it happens, but I'm not going to look at it. Okay, for now, right? And then he looks at a second way. He puts this to one side and then he looks at it again. And he says, okay, well, there is another way in which this AB dash now can be made shorter. Let's just say again that it's down to 9 hours, as we've said before. But let's suppose that it doesn't mean a reduction in the use values that the workers consume, but rather that the basket of commodities is the same, except that they can be made more cheaply. That, in other words, the use value stays the same, but the exchange value of the commodities consumed is reduced. Okay, so that would lower the value of labor power, a fall in this value itself, if you get the distinction. The workers don't lose anything in terms of the use values. They have a lower wage, but with that lower wage, they can buy the same basket of goods. So wages are lower as they were in our first sort of case, but for a different reason. Now, this, Marx argues, will be only possible if it's the indirect effect of productivity increases. So if the labor producing the commodities that workers consume, back to our cotton yarn and shirts and dresses, if that's more productive, then their value will go down. It will shorten the value of those commodities, and that in turn means a necessary labor time for a worker to live consuming them can be reduced. Okay. Now, the increase of productivity that Marx is talking about, which would do this, means that the labor producing yarn or shirts or dresses has to produce more use values, has to produce more stuff, okay, in any given hour, any given working day. Okay. So he then says, capital can do this, but the way it does it is by revolutionizing the technical and social conditions of the process. Okay, and in that way, capital can and does, in fact, we'll see it's a real driver actually of the capitalist mode of production, increase the productivity of labor. The motive of capital, by the way, is not specifically to increase the productivity of labor, but as we'll see, it's a major lever whereby capitalists or individual capitalists can make more profits. Okay, now Marx calls this relative surplus value, and it's relative because the length of the working day overall is not changed. It's just the relative length of necessary labor time is reduced compared to the overall labor time. Okay, so that's, he's talking about the respective lengths of the two components of the working day. So just so far, he's looked at two different ways in which AB can be reduced. He's put one to one side, which is just a straightforward wage cut, but he is going to look in a lot more detail at the second method, which he considers to be, if you like, more dynamic within the capitalist mode of production, which is by increasing the productivity of labor in those areas that produce commodities that workers consume. So this is the way Marx introduces labor productivity. Okay. And he says this text is repeating what I've already said, and Marx has sort of explained it in as typically in his case in a great deal of sort of methodical detail. Now, the next point is this. So far, we just talked about, okay, an overall effect. But he locates this as actually really a driver of individual capitalist interest. So when an individual capitalist cheapens shirts, okay, so we have a shirt maker, okay, by increasing the productivity of labor, he by no means necessarily aims to reduce the value of labor power and shorten necessary labor time in proportion to this, which is, what I've just been describing. But he contributes towards increasing the general rate of surplus value only insofar as he ultimately contributes to this result. Okay, so it's not a matter of the will, even the collective will of a aggregate of individual capitals that they want to do this. It is the way they want to make more money, they want to make more profit, but that by adopting greater productivity, the overall effect will be this. Marx gives us in quite a lot of detail, and I'm actually going to go even more into the detail than Marx did, so brace yourselves. A worked example. And he says, let's suppose we've got workers producing per worker per day of 12 hours, 12 articles. And if you remember the old sort of notation, 12D is 12 pence, and there are 12 pence and a shilling. So each article is worth 1 shilling or 12 pence. And he says, okay, well, let's say half of this is the means of production value which the worker's reproducing, and half of it, 6 pence, is the new value that the worker's producing. So it's a very simple example. Okay, now let's suppose that one capitalist doubles the productivity of the labor working under their employment. Okay, that means that those workers are going to produce twice as many articles in the 12 hours. They're going to produce 24 articles. Now, watch this carefully now, right? What he's saying is each article will still use up or contain the used up means of production of 6 pence, okay? But the new value created will just be 3 pence. If this is the new regime, and I will slightly misspoke, if this settles to be the new regime of labor productivity, what it means is labor is now spread over twice as many articles. So the prevailing productivity shifts from 12 articles per workday to 24 articles per workday. So the amount of new value created in the day does not change. That's 6 shillings, but it's now spread over 24 articles rather than 12 articles. So the new value created has gone down from 6 pence to 3 pence. Okay, so basically you've got cheaper articles because labor is more productive. Now, if one capitalist is the first mover in this, they will be producing their articles at an individual value of 9 pence per article, whereas the rest of the capitalists producing the same article will still be producing their articles at the value of individual values, if you like, of 12 pence. So where is the social value? You've got two different rates of productivity in the same sector, okay? And that's a dynamic situation. I mean, competition comes into play. Competition, market dynamics will sort of, they don't cause this, but they're the means by which this is expressed. It's the distinct productivities of different individual capitals are expressed through market competition. And the other aspect which Marx is very well aware of, it also depends now on how much demands for these articles the market will bear. So, and he basically knows, right, that in the end, this article would be priced, not in the end, in the first instance of the new productivity, somewhere between 12 pence and 9 pence. He could have said 10.5 pence, he could have said 11 pence. He said, well, let's say articles now sell at 10 pence, okay? So they're above the individual value for this innovating capital, but they're below what the expenditure of labor for this one. Okay, right. So what his main attention is here. Okay, and what he says is this means we've got an extra surplus value. They're produced for 9p, but they can be sold at 10p. Okay, so this, he says, is an augmentation of surplus value, and it's pocketed by the capitalist, whether or not, and this does not rely, this could be yachts, actually. I mean, if some capitalists makes yachts quicker than others, or more productive labor than others, or let's say tanks or anti-aircraft weapons, or anything, you know, that workers don't directly consume, even though they might consume them, right? So what we've got is, this is an inherent driver. Capital, any capitalist sector, any capital working in competition will be susceptible to this type of drive. Okay, right. So there's always a motive for an individual capitalist to cheapen the commodities that their workers produce by increasing the productivity of the labor. Now, this, he spells this out quite carefully, and it is important to grasp it. And this is what you might think of as levels of abstraction. Okay, so if we think of this before the change, we have our working day, and for the whole day, for the whole worker's day, we know a new value of 6 shillings, 12 articles, 1 shilling each. 6 shillings is new value, 6 shillings is the reproduced value, or reincarnated is the preferred word, of the content capital. Okay, okay, so that's, if you like, our starting condition. Then he says, okay, well, let's have a look at what happens when we have more productive labor. So he says, he uses the term intensified labor, which is actually, I don't know if it's an issue of translation, but other writers use the term enhanced labor. Okay, because Marx uses intensification in a different sense generally, right? Okay, so what you've got is it takes less time to produce each article. And so what you need to think about now is, what does this mean for the working day? Well, what it means is, in each hour, the worker is adding more value than they did before. If they sell at 10p, 24 articles, you can do the arithmetic. That's 240p. Okay, that is, quickly work it out. That's here you go. That's 20 shillings. Okay, now they're producing twice as many articles. So that means that the elements of constant capital are double, right? Per worker per day. There's more cotton, there's more stuff going into that product. Okay, but at the same time, the workers in this innovating capital are able to add a value which, when it's sold on the market, is now 8 shillings, whereas before it was 6 shillings. So Marx sees this as an extra surplus value, not the ordinary surplus value which we had before, 1 shilling. It's now gone up to 3 shillings. Okay, this is particular to the innovating capital, right? So that means that the rate of new value addition is increased. This triangle means it's a higher gradient. So each hour, these workers are actually adding more value in this conception. Okay, now Marx says the ratio is now, instead of 1 to 5, S over V, it's now 3 to 5. And he also says, and the text has actually got an arithmetic mistake. In fact, he says 7 1/5. It's actually 7.5 hours and 4.5 hours. So the surplus labor time has gone up from 2 hours to 4.5 hours. So what you've got here is an elasticity between labor time and money. It's not fixed. It moves, and it has to move as the productivity of labor moves. It has to move. It has to have this capacity to move. Right. Now what Marx says is, okay, so what happens now is, once this new method is generalized in the sector, okay, then what happens is, actually things settle down again, and all the capitalists either adapt or die, basically, as capitals, right? So if all the capitalists now adopt the new whatever it is to make the workers more productive, then all of them will be producing 24 articles a day, in actual fact, the price will fall to 9p because we're kind of like back to where we were before. So the use value is increased, but the actual value creation during the day is back to where it was before. Okay, except new value creation as it was before, but the constant capital recreation has increased. Okay, because we've got more stuff, we've got more cotton, we've got more use of machinery and so on. So if you like, the relationship between the workers and the materials that they're working with has changed. Okay, so the extra surplus value vanishes insofar as the other capitalists adopt the new method. Okay, this is the way capitalism works. It's a very sort of familiar pattern in actual fact. So Marx sees this as an imminent drive, okay, because every capital is going to be, susceptible or inclined to adopt this method of increasing and getting a surplus profit or extra surplus value in the short term. Okay, so although I've said this is an end state, it's not a fixed end state. Wait for the next innovation and it will go on again, and so it's a constant issue. That's why Marx says it's continually revolutionizing. He sees capitalism in that sense as revolutionizing the means of production and its imminent drive of the mode of production. So he sort of reflects on this, and he basically says, well, what we've got is the value of commodities is in inverse ratio to the productivity of labor. It's quite important to also do a side note here. When Marx writes about value, he's actually very often meaning exchange value, because it's what's expressed in money. It's how the value appears. Okay, so certainly the exchange value of commodities, and in this case, it also applies to value. The socially necessary labor time per commodity is reduced as the productivity of labor increases. On the other hand, he says that the relative surplus value will increase as productivity of labor increases. So that's why there's this imminent drive. And I'll just sort of highlight it. He's actually notes here exchange value. Okay, so there we are. Now, what does all this mean? In my diagrammatic terms, this is what Marx is saying. He's saying this is the before as a general condition in that sector. 12 articles per day per worker. This is after more 24 articles, more constant capital being used up in production, but the only way that the rate of surplus value will increase is if it so happens we have this feedback loop. If it so happens that what's being produced is also now cheaper, is also being consumed by the workers. So if it shirts, yes, there will be then possible a lower wage without any reduction in the use values workers consume. Right. So what we have here is what actually happens, by the way, is this: when this happens, workers will resist the downward pressure on wages. Of course they will, so they should, right? And so what happens is they get some small share of their increased productivity. And again, that's very lively in the debate right now. What happens then is workers are more productive of use values, and yet they're more exploited. That rate of surplus value is higher. Okay. Now, the other thing is to bear in mind is what this also means is what issue. At the moment, I've just been speaking this in a relatively passive way. Incidentally, we have an increase in the constant capital that goes over into the commodities. But actually, this is also an important part of how capital measures itself. Right. Now, relative surplus value is really important for Marx. It really is at the hub of his explanation of capitalist mode of production, and he builds on it in three ways. First of all, he does look at the methods, which I haven't mentioned at all yet, but he goes into the social and technical methods by which capital increases surplus value, okay, by making labor more productive. But more than that, he sees this as carrying inherent systemic contradictions. And first of all, I mean, we'll see in a second an example I'll give you of how this tends, and it's intuitively pretty obvious, towards the concentration of capital, fewer capitalist companies under these conditions. Marx goes into this an awful lot in volume 1 on the question of how capital reproduces itself and generates a relative surplus population. And so he comes back to it as a dynamic of the system overall. But even more than that, what he shows in volume 3 is that this is an inherent tendency to crisis. Increasing labor productivity within the capitalist mode of production is a tendency to crisis of the capitalist mode of production. And he sees that quite rightly as a historical limit of the capitalist mode of production. So I made a couple of queries and I come back to them here. The working day is given, well, in actual fact, it wasn't quite given in the sense that different sections of workers have to work different lengths of the working day. And it's very different if you talk about workers in the colonies. So it's not just an economic question, it's a social and political question, how long the working day is. It's class struggle occurs in a certain context. And secondly, related to that, once again, this is sort of querying his thing about why, even though it's important in practice, why it is that he keeps passing over this thing about price of labor power being below its value. Okay. What we've seen is that not all workers are paid the same. I mean, women workers in that time were not paid the same as men workers. And it's a consistent pattern within capitalist social relations. What we're going to see in actually, there's a further tendency inherent in the capitalist mode of production of polarization between groups of workers. So this is a comradely criticism. Marx looks at competition of capitals, that's firmly within his scope, but he postpones tackling theoretically the consequences of the competition between workers, and it affects surplus value, the competition between workers. So these are certain methodological constraints. He said we are constrained by our own assumption that all commodities sell at their value, and that works at a certain level of abstraction. But it is interesting, as soon as Marx popularizes in any way whatsoever his own theory, he brings in competition between workers. And indeed he has to, because that's the way workers experience the capitalist mode of production. So finally, what we've seen is that commodities selling at their full value, what that means is itself not a fixed thing. It's actually dynamic and moving contradiction. Now what I'm going to do is just for completeness, really, Marx said 10 pence. He could have said 11 pence. You know, when this 12 pence article, suddenly the individual value of the innovating capital means they can be sold for 9 pence. Well, it depends on circumstance, but I mean, let's just say that the market would allow the commodities to be sold at 11 pence. Now, if they were sold at 11 pence, the other capitals wouldn't make a profit because it would eat up all the surplus value, but they would operate on a cost level, basically. Okay. But what he actually said is articles will sell at 10 pence. And in those circumstances, the competing capitals are going to go out of business, or they're going to have to adopt a new method, one or the other. Okay. But what this also means is there's a certain implicit consequence of increasing relative surplus value by this method, which is the conditions of capital and labor in the other capitals. What they're going to do? Well, what they're going to do, are they going to try to cheapen their elements of production in some way? Downward pressure on wages. That in reality, that's what often occurs. That if you like, the laggard capitals, one of their first responses is, we're not doing so well in the market. Our workers, you have to you have to tighten your belts. You have to take a wage cut. And the other one is, of course, they could force them to work longer. So we're back to absolute surplus value here. So relative surplus value does not operate in a vacuum. It's part of a dynamic interconnection. Now, I don't know why the sequence here has jumped. I'll have to look at my thing. But what we've got here is one last comment that Marx makes. He does write about what this means for the rate of surplus value, which is S over V, as we know, and the rate of profit, which, to remind you, is surplus value over all the capital used up, actually, in this case, right? Now, Marx doesn't do this calculation, but he offers, it's there to be done, basically. I've just made a supposition. Say we have 10 capitalists, each has got 100 workers. So we've got 1,000 workers producing these articles at a shilling each. So they're going to produce 12 a day, 1,000 workers, they're going to produce 12,000 articles. Now, what Marx has also developed a theory for is we can deconstruct this value into its components, which is 6,000 reproduced constant capital, 5,000 reproduced variable capital, reincarnated, reproduced, and 1,000 surplus value. Okay, so that adds up to our 12,000. And this ratio, S over V in this case, is only 20%. He normally gives us a figure about 100%, by the way. And the ratio which provides the rate of profit is 1,000 over all of the capital, which is 1,000 over 11,000, or 9%. Okay, that was the before. Now, what's interesting is look at the after. I'm supposing that if you doubled the productivity, and let's say the market would bear at 9p this number of articles, then that would be produced by 7 capitalists. So already we've got fewer capitalists, okay, and yet more articles are being produced. Now, the value of the commodity product has only barely gone up at all, and most of the increase in the value is actually in the constant part. In actual fact, the new value created under the conditions that I'm assuming, which are fairly realistic, the new value created has actually gone down. Okay, now rate of surplus value the same, but the rate of profit, new value over capital used up in this case, right, it's gone down quite a lot. Okay, so this is the effect of increasing productivity, is actually a decline, and this is very provisional because these figures don't include a lot of other things that actually do need to be included to get the real rate of profit, but it's sort of like an indicator, provisional rate of profit. Okay, and what it means is that as within the capitalist mode of production, as labor productivity increases, more and more dead labor is put in motion by the living labor that remains. Okay, and in actual fact dominates more and more. Okay, there's a pause now. That's part one. Part two is shorter, and I'm going to deal with this a bit more quickly, but I have dealt with relative surplus value in a lot of detail, and because it is an area where the interpretations, I think, need a lot of clarity. Marx talks about cooperation. Now we've got a slight rewind. Okay, what is cooperation? He says, well, what cooperation is a large number of workers working together. Okay, and he says that if you look at capitalism, when capitalism starts, one of the first ways it starts is by obliging cooperation. So cooperation is a slightly inverted commas here, right? And it doesn't change the actual individual skills of the workers, right? It just puts them together. And why should that be in capital's interest? Why does it matter putting workers together? And these are some examples of handicraft production. Okay, so the worker is still an artisan basically, but they're all put together in the same place at the same time. And there is an immediate advantage, which is pretty obvious, which is it spreads the overheads. So you've got a way of cheapening the cost of production without actually really touching the labor process hardly at all. So this is actually, is a common characteristic. Okay, economy in the application of the means of production. This photo is actually a photo of a hobby workshop, and it's cheaper for people to pursue their hobby if they can use the same tools, have the same electricity, use the same workshop, and so on, right? So cooperation in this sense, right, is not directly capitalist. It's just illustrating an advantage of cooperation. So cooperation comes in all shapes and sizes and all modes of production, right? So economy in the use of the means of production, cheapening commodities. In the capitalist mode of production, cheaper constant capital means that the ratio of living labor to dead labor goes back up again, and so the rate of profit will be increased. Okay. Now what Marx says here is very interesting. He looks at this very analytically, as is his custom, and he says what I'm doing here analytically is what capitalism actually does. It takes handicraft workers, puts them together in a workshop, and then it starts tearing them apart. It starts deconstructing them and reconstructing them. He's got a lot of interesting points, which I'm just going to skim fairly quickly. You can read them and discuss them, right? He points out a whole number of different ways in which working collectively increases productivity. Now, the issue is, and there's all kinds of points to this, okay, and these are all attributes of working collectively. The issue is that they are a collectivity of labor, and the collectivity of labor is a productive power which arises due to cooperation. It's a social cooperation. But when the capitalist brings workers together, it appears as though this advantage of cooperation is an attribute of the capitalist. It's because the capitalist brought people together that they are the ones who, if you like, are identified as being responsible for the advantages of cooperation. Okay, so he's putting this into the context of capitalist form of cooperation. But also, I mean, the way capital introduces cooperation is not voluntary, or barely voluntary, let's say. It's an obligation on the workers that they have to sell their labor, they have to go to the workshop. Okay, so capital has to supervise. It's cooperative, again, inverted commas, it's cooperative under labor superintendence. This picture is of women workers in the First World War. I think it's in England, it's from Reading. And I mean, the reason I'm using the picture is of a later period, but I mean, what you've got here is not a high degree of division of labor. As far as you can see from the photo, the workers here, they're all doing more or less the same thing. Okay, they're sorting out shells and cartridges, basically. So it's not yet, in this case, a high degree of division of labor, and yet capital has put workers together in order to produce in this way. So the capitalism and cooperation is twofold, right? It's first of all, it's got control of the purpose. Okay, it's what it wants to do. It's under its direction that whatever it is happens. And this is Marx's big point. Okay, I've really sort of highlighted it in red. The social productive power of labor develops as a free gift to capital whenever the workers are placed under certain conditions, and it is capital which places them under these conditions. Because this power costs capital nothing, while on the other hand it's not developed by the worker until his labor itself belongs to capital, it appears as a power which capital possesses by its nature, a productive power inherent in capital. Now, this really is the power of intellect, uncovering something that needs to be uncovered from a class perspective. This is taken from this study of handicraft work in India. And this is actually from a management magazine. That's interesting, right? So what you have is, from a management perspective, the different tasks are being broken down, and they will be reorganized according to the interests of managers rather than of the workers. Okay, so what Marx says is capitalist cooperation is imposed on peasants and artisans, and that's why they will rebel against it. So you know, cooperation is used in other social modes of production, but in the history of capitalism, cooperation came from capital. Okay, and so they're going to fight it. And it's not only peasants and artisans. I mean, I've put in this picture just to show, this is again an enforced cooperation on slave plantations, which, you know, capital put workers, African workers, on the plantations, right, in collective labor, but in capital's interests. So Marx is talking about simple cooperation, handicraft before manufacture. Now, manufacture is the idea of a workshop where there is a division of labor. So he's kind of like got this idea, which is both historical development and, if you like, a logical starting point. So he says all capitalist factory type production is based on cooperation, but the earliest form of it, you don't see a high division of labor. I mean, each person here is doing their job. I'm really not sure how romanticized these or the other pictures are, right? But that's the basic idea. So somebody's doing the spinning, somebody's doing the weaving, and so on, right? So far, Marx's argument on cooperation is it's centralizing, it's under one command, it's contrast with other modes of production. Now, he doesn't actually make this point, but I make this point about his narrative, which is, if you remember from chapter 10, he talked about this long struggle to lengthen the working day. So they're not separate things again, right? Putting workers into workshops was also co-terminal with the struggle to lengthen the working day, right? He uses the term subsumption, and he develops this quite a lot in the later sort of appendix to volume 1. Okay, and so he's basically saying with cooperation, it's going to become more developed. From cooperation, capitalism will have more developed forms where it does intervene directly in the labor process and take hold of it beyond handicraft workers in the under the same roof. Okay, it will reorganize production, and from that there will be a division of labor which is specifically capitalist, and beyond that again it will introduce machines. So there are two methods beyond simple cooperation. All of this is a lot of discussion, and interestingly, there's some big issues, I think, about how much capitalism is just about the workshop and the factory. Marx, again, is aware of this, but it's not really a point he develops very much, but it's something that needs developing. I mean, when I talk to my comrades in Latin America about Marx's Capital, they say it's good, but what about informal production? That's what, you know, is like a dominant mode of exploitation in our societies today. So there are starting points in Marx to help with that. He does talk about outworkers. He talks about the putting out system here and there. It's a big debate in Japan, by the way, about the origins of capitalism. I was just looking for the reference and I couldn't find it in time, but I mean, I'm aware that Marxists in Japan have quite a big debate about this. It is the case that in Marx's explanation, he says in this book, in Capital, he says actually very little about putting out. It's all about bringing the workers together and the starting point of workshops into manufacture. Okay, but there is this question of informal production, which is important today, once again. Okay, I am going to leave it there. I think, well, I think the reading groups can discuss this, but I mean, I think you're doing fine, but I think the rate we're going to be well into next year, and I've got no problem with that, but we have to be realistic. And I'm just saying that in terms of the content I put in each lecture to keep me going monthly. And here's some recommended reading. And actually, that is the end of the lecture. Thank you.